the Australian Psychedelic Society it's really about community, developing community in different cities and across Australia, because there's increasing interest in the area. There's increasing people going out doing ayahuasca circles in the community, and so the APS, the Australian Psychedelic Society, is set up to help bring people together that might not be already connected with like-minded people. In addition to that, the APS aims to engage the broader community to have conversations around psychedelics and ultimately advocate and educate. So it's with great pleasure today that we've got Dr. David O'Shaughnessy here to give a presentation on ayahuasca and other plant medicines based on his research in South America, and he's kindly said that he will do his own little introduction.
No problem.
I'll hand it over to David.
Thanks, Stephen. Thank you. Thanks for coming up to Joondalup to listen to me talk today. I'm going to be talking about the traditional use of psychoactive plants, and in particular ayahuasca, but there'll be a lot of other different plants that will come up as well. Ayahuasca will be the focus, especially in the context of South America, although ayahuasca has moved out sort of into the world. So a little bit of background about myself, where I'm coming from here. I'm an anthropologist, although originally I did software engineering and then jumped into psychology with the interest in working with plant medicines, and then became more of a medical anthropologist during my PhD. So that was done in Peru, so we lived in Peru for a year. At the Takawasi Centre, well, not living in the centre, but living in Tarapoto. And Takawasi is an addiction treatment centre, and they fuse Amazonian medicine with Western medical approaches in treating primarily drug addiction, but other kinds of addictions as well. And Amazonian medicine includes ayahuasca, but a whole bunch of other techniques as well. And that was sort of where my ideas of ayahuasca medicine got expanded. I went there particularly to study ayahuasca, and then came away with a much broader perception of Amazonian medicine. I'll touch on that in the talk. More recently, I've been doing cross-cultural work through Berkeley University in the US with the Chamane people in Bolivia. So they're a remote indigenous people, and the theme of this actually has nothing to do with plants. It's more to do with mathematics and education and the way that people learn numbers and numeracy. But they're an interesting situation. The people are sort of going through a process of market integration, a slow process. And I'll mention a few things about shamanism to do with the Chamane, because their last shaman, I think, died 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, something like that. So it's an extinct tradition now amongst the Chamane, as far as I know. But there are some interesting points that we'll touch back and forth on. So that's where I'm coming from. The topic today, I guess, talking about plant medicines, but in the context of the psychedelic revival or renaissance, it's called. I'm sure everyone here understands the situation, but just to lay it out, generally we're talking about the use of psychedelics or psychoactive substances plus some form of psychotherapy. I'm sure most people are probably pretty excited about what's going on, and it's surprising as well that this is all coming from starting in the US, the home of the war on drugs. So things are turning around, which is excellent. But a point that often comes up, and what I want to contrast today, is this idea that psychedelic medicines have a long history of use in the use of similar substances. And here's some examples of some of the more famous ones going around. You've got the vine, ayahuasca, in the top left, iboga from Africa in the top right, San Pedro, huachuma, known in Peru, psilocybin mushrooms, and peyote as well. Very well known. And what I want to look at is how straight, I guess, is the line from the past to what's happening now. And to cut the whole thing very short, not very straight, but I'll lay out the details of it as we go along. So I'm not sure everyone necessarily has a handle on what anthropology is, probably including anthropologists, but I'll lay it out sort of in a simplistic fashion, the way I understand it at least, you tend to have, you can contrast anthropology with the hard sciences, I guess, or the way that science tends to tell its stories about what's happening. So generally you have science giving you the truth, or it's aiming for that anyway, some sort of universal theory that explains everything. It's sort of the aim in general. So in that sense, if you apply that to psychedelics, they do X, Y, Z, whatever that may be. Usually that's couched in some kind of neural terms, because that seems to be the most rigorous or objective thing to latch onto. So these theories like rebus, I can't remember what's relaxed beliefs under psychedelics, I think, default mode network, all those kind of ideas, and they're seen to be universal. You put this drug into a human body, and it has this effect. The anthropologist story tends to be not looking for a single truth at all, but looking for multiple truths, and these are sort of famously, cultural relativism. These are relative truths, so they depend on some kind of position where you stand. So the truth of the thing, whatever you're dealing with, is relative to the position of the person looking at it. So this includes personal circumstance, cultural patterning, and social structural conditions. And all those things will determine what this substance is that we're talking about in its use. And this is not especially radical. It's sort of in basic psychedelic theory, the set and setting idea that's been around since the 60s. I think Leary was one of the first to put it down. And basically set and setting just says that if you're taking a psychedelic drug, the outcome of what happens will be determined by those two things in conjunction with the drug. So the set, as in your mind, your expectations, what you're looking for, what you bring to it, and then the setting, what happens in the context of the drug administration. And you can get some pretty radical effects. There's a paper published recently. They're giving people just plain placebo and really, really ramping up the setting as if they're having psilocybin. And a decent number of people had really quite profound experiences, but they really only got a placebo. So it's kind of implied in basic psychedelic theory that the context matters. So that's sort of where I'm coming from. Well, in anthropology, that context includes it's much broader, the social context as well. So altered states of consciousness, it is true. We can definitely say that the alteration of consciousness is widespread throughout history and humanity. On the left here, there's a paper that I read a long time ago, but it's from 1977. Taking a sort of evolutionary perspective on altered states of consciousness and the prevalence throughout the world. And they broke them down into two different types, sacred alteration of consciousness they're talking about. So either involving some sort of hallucinations or visions, or transpossession as well. And they looked at 488 societies in an atlas, an ethnographic atlas of world societies, and found something like 90% do have an institutionalized form of alteration of consciousness in a sacred fashion. So that you could say that it is the norm, has been the norm around the world, let's say. On the right-hand side there is a book by Ronald Siegel, and also taking an evolutionary perspective, but he's looking at animal behaviour more broadly. And a bunch of examples from different animals of them also taking plant substances to alter their consciousness. So it is widespread, and his argument is that altering consciousness is something like a fourth drive. So it comes after food, sleep, and sex. All animals look for those things, and then altering your consciousness is a fourth one. That was his argument. And some of the recent archaeological evidence. This is from a find, I think, a couple of years back. That is 3 fox noses sewn together into a little pouch. This was found in Bolivia about 1,000 years ago. And inside the pouch, there were these snuff boxes and other paraphernalia, which contain traces of harmine, DMT, cocaine, a few other substances. So, the things to make ayahuasca are in there. And this snuff box is for putting the substance up your nose to get the effect of the drug. So you can see the intricate carvings are quite beautiful. So this is obviously some sort of ritualized practice, probably shamanic activity. That's going back 1,000 years, and we could say that it's most likely older than that. That's just what's been found. So shamanism in South America. Shamanism is a broad topic, but South America is the context that I'm most familiar with, so I'm going to focus on that. But there's some things you can say that are fundamental or general to all forms of shamanism. And one is the idea of an invisible world that the shaman has access to. In this particular painting, you can see the people drinking ayahuasca are in the bottom left-hand corner, and there's an entire alternate sort of reality or invisible world that becomes manifest after drinking the ayahuasca. So this idea of the shaman basically has privileged access to something that the other people are not aware of, and it often concerns the ultimate nature of reality. So cosmology, you could say that. It ties into stories of what we're here for, where the universe came from, ultimate nature of reality. And each shamanic sort of culture will have its own explanation, but it almost always, in fact probably does always revolve around this idea of revealing an invisible world that can't normally be perceived. So shamanism in its indigenous contexts can be understood in many different ways, and it's been described in anthropology as like a system of philosophy, ethics, politics, medicine. That's very common. There's ideas about health and illness involved, also war and systems of ecology. So you can almost think of it as a totalizing system for organizing society around some particular way of thinking. And a good jumping in point to look at some specific examples of how this works is ayahuasca. You can see there the vine, the ayahuasca vine, Banisteropsis carpe. This is really well-known shamanic tool, very widespread throughout South America and the globe now. And I expect that a lot of people here have probably heard of ayahuasca before, maybe very high percentage, and probably as a healing medicine, and maybe also as the idea of it is DMT plus these Hamala alkaloids that enable the DMT. So the vine doesn't have DMT in it. The vine contains the beta-carbolines, the Hamala alkaloids, which activate the DMT from the leaf in the stomach. If you just ate the leaves on your own, nothing would happen. If you snuff them, they would work, but the stomach will break it down, and the vine activates that process. But in fact, DMT is not actually always involved in the indigenous use of ayahuasca, and they call that vine itself ayahuasca. So the constant thing that is always there is the vine, not so much the leaf with the DMT in it. And the vine is used on its own. Even today, the Awahun people in Peru will make brews out of the pure vine, and it's quite strong. So it has its effects. Now, some of the earliest accounts of, just to kind of stick onto this point of the importance of the vine, this is the earliest account, in English anyway, the Spanish described the use of ayahuasca in South America, but the earliest English account is Richard Spruce from 1856 roughly, where he was travelling through. He described an ayahuasca session that occurred, and just to give you a sense of the timescale here, that's a drawing that he made upon arriving in Tarapoto. Incidentally, that's where I did my field work for a PhD, and down the bottom right-hand corner is Tarapoto, today more or less. So there's been a lot of change. So back when Spruce was there, this is early days. And he gives this account. I mean, I won't read this particular quote out, but what he describes basically is sort of a festival with dancing and displays of warfare. There's a lot of drinking of carpe. He doesn't mention any leaves being put in the mixture, but also beer made out of yucca, manioc, and he mentions tobacco, cigars as thick as your wrist. So there's huge amounts of tobacco that people are smoking as well. It's effectively some kind of collective ceremony or festival, and there's displays of warfare and so on. But the quote's in there. I mean, I'll share the slides. If anyone wants them afterwards, just let me know and I'll pass them on. So this is, mid-1800s, quite different to the way we see ayahuasca used today. About 100 years later, you've got Richard Evans Schultes describing the widespread usage of carpe throughout South America, and its really sort of pervasive importance. So he says, this one's worth going through. He says, nor perhaps as any other beta-carboline plant, talking about the vine there, not the leaf, so intimately and irrevocably captured a place of such all-pervading potency in the life and death of South American peoples who value it as a medicine, hallucinogen, sacred element that permeates in their concept all of creation. So you have this plant that is somehow deeply embedded in ideas about life at sort of every level. Saying it plays a role in relations between individuals, sickness and health, peace and war, hunting and agriculture. It's sort of hard to understand, on the face of it, how can it be so important? But the shamanic idea of, I'll give some concrete examples after, of how it gives a totalizing system will make a bit more sense. So the first example here from Michael Hana, who did some work with Ashur in Ecuador, to give an example of the way they view life. He says, the normal waking life for the Ashur is simply a lie or an illusion, while the true forces that determine daily events are supernatural and can only be seen and manipulated with the aid of hallucinogenic drugs. In this case, that would be ayahuasca, but also tobacco, which is really widely dispersed throughout shamanic practice. So, if daily events are determined through the supernatural level, and only the shaman can access them, and then he's the one that knows, what is really going on in society and has quite a serious amount of control over what's happening. So, to learn how to become a shaman, natema is the local word for it, but it's ayahuasca. He drinks this repeatedly, and including 3 months of sexual abstinence as a minimum. A year is even better. And this is very, very common. I think it may even be universal for learning shamanism in South America. And then once this process goes on, if he's successful, he receives these darts. And the darts are physical, actual darts that you can hold, but only the shaman can see the true spiritual nature of them, the power that they have. This is the idea. And the darts are the main element for determining health and sickness. You can heal with them, but you can kill with them as well. So a shaman could go in either direction in this. He could become a killer, or he could become a sorcerer, or he could become a healer. Now, the interesting point on this is that if a healing shaman comes in to fix someone's illness, it's not the patient that drinks the ayahuasca, it's the shaman that drinks it, because he wants to be able to see inside the body and see where the offending dart has gone in, which was sent supernaturally, and then to remove that out. That's the concept. So this is completely reversed from the way that we would think about psychedelic medicine, for example. So it's used more as a revealer of that invisible world through which all things are actually functioning. And Hana has an interesting way he got started. This is from a paper. He says, for several hours after drinking the brew, this is his first time actually in Peru with the Canibo, before it was Shipibo Canibo. For several hours after drinking the brew, I found myself, although awake, in a world literally beyond my wildest dreams. I met bird-headed people as well as dragon-like creatures who came from outer space and explained they were the true gods of this world. So these dragons that he saw that he kind of went back into the beginning of evolution or something. And these dragons came back to Earth and were running away from something, turned themselves into small dots, landed on Earth, and all life grew out of these dragons. And the dragons started telling him, we really run things. We're the ones that, we're inside your body. We're in control of you. And he got this feeling they were sort of malevolent and a little bit evil. And he went to talk to an old blind shaman and talked to him about his experience that he had. And when he started mentioning the dragons and how they sort of supposedly control everything, the shaman apparently knew what he was talking about and said, no, don't worry about those. They always say that. But they're only the masters of the outer darkness, and he waved up towards the sky. And Hana hadn't told him yet that they came from outer space, and he found that quite disturbing, that the old shaman seemed to basically know the terrain that he was talking about. And that was kind of how he got started with... he was an anthropologist, but he became a shaman, and he wrote a book, The Way of the Shaman, and some ideas about how to practice it. So that's one case of a shamanic system. The darts, by the way, are really common throughout South America as well. Now, just to move for a second away from ayahuasca, Johannes Wilbert did some really, really interesting work. Recommend reading some of this guy's stuff with the Warao in Venezuela. This is tobacco shamanism. So, I kind of mentioned the importance of tobacco, but in this case, this is what they use only. The only hallucinogenic plant they use is tobacco, and we probably don't normally think of it as a hallucinogenic plant, but if you consider this method of application, it says young Indian shamans are deprived of normal food for long periods during which they become emaciated, almost to the point of skeletonization. So you're getting close to actual death. Instead of food, they're repeatedly fed large quantities of liquefied tobacco, both through the nose and mouth, to induce narcotic trances. In this state, the novice makes his first celestial ascent to meet face-to-face with the spirits inhabiting the other world. So, under those conditions, I think tobacco would be pretty psychoactive. So, and there's a kind of interesting point there that shamanic conceptions of substance use are kind of advanced in the sense that they include the state of the body. They're always very concerned about what you've been eating, what you've been doing, and under these conditions, this plant does this. Under these conditions, it's a different thing. So, and on top of that, you have a sort of cultural preparation that comes beforehand to give some directionality to the experiences. So these guys have a really complicated system of shamanism. There's like 4 types of shamans. You could do a whole lecture series on what it's all about. But just as sort of one example, they have of the differences. There's a healing shaman, but there's also a killing shaman. And this is not like a secret thing. It's a socially sanctioned role because sometimes the gods need basically human sacrifice, and it's this guy's job to pick someone. So he'll disappear off into the jungle, and everyone knows when the killing shaman goes off into the jungle by himself, someone is going to get it. And he, in his conception, these tendrils come out of his nose that he develops through his shamanic system, and he goes looking for someone and wraps around their heart, and someone's going to start feeling bad. The only way to reverse this process is that if you know a killing shaman who's you're on good terms with, he can undo it. So they're kind of ambivalent. Like the killing shaman could be your friend. He could be. It's hard to say the way it works. But the interesting point on all this is how codified their system is and detailed. It's quite amazing. And new shamans have to pass through these very specific tests that they're experiencing, in this altered state, to be able to become a shaman. So definitely the cultural stories and patterning imprints on the experience, which is set and setting type of idea, but this is embedded in the whole society, and this is all happening just with tobacco. So while we might not consider it to be a hallucinogen in a particular context, it's more or less indistinguishable from the the classic hallucinogens. So okay, the last one that I'll describe, just to give a taste of how I guess different these situations can be, is Dolmatov's work with the Tucano. This involves ayahuasca and tobacco. There's always tobacco involved. And again, they have a very well-defined and codified system of what the universe is and how it works. And he described their shamanic system as a kind of ecologically adaptive system of rules. So what is that? It's these people living within the confines of some kind of area. And you can't go to the shops and buy things. You have to live with what is there. You've got to eat the animals, you've got to eat the plants, and if you overhunt, you're finished. So you've got to live in balance with what's actually there, and that is their system. They have this idea of the sun god, which is actually the sun sending its rays down to the feminine earth, which includes all life on earth, including people, and this sort of exchange of energy. And they're very concerned with keeping this system in balance. If you throw it out of balance, then you get problems. So there's a whole system of rules about when and where you can hunt, what you can eat, when you can eat it, when you can have children, when you can't. It's really quite controlling system of ideas that are functioning through these taboos. You can't do this at this time. And as I said, it's concerned with balance. You never want to overproduce. You don't produce more than you need, and you never want to overconsume. You have to maintain a balance between the system. And the one question is, why would people follow these rules? Because they're not explained in terms of ecological balance. They're explained in terms of a cosmology. And the way that it works is that the taboos and the restrictions are linked into a theory of illness, basically. So you link illness to this mythical or social responsibility. You have to do these things to keep the gods happy, or whatever the situation may be, or the animals happy. In South American shamanism, almost always animals and plants tend to be essentially just people as well. So you can talk about the spirit of a jaguar, for example, has this internal essence that's the same as essentially the same as a person. And he says it might be said that a Tucano shaman does not have individual patients. His task is to cure a social malfunctioning. So when someone's sick, it's actually their own fault in this system. They've obviously broken the rules somewhere. They've violated the taboos. They're overhunting in this area, and you've angered the animals, and that results in sickness. So it's explained in that way. And just to sum up sort of the way they view things, it's quite interesting. He says, the cosmological myths which express the Tucano worldview do not describe man's place in nature in terms of dominion or mastery over subordinate environment, nor do they in any way express the notion of what some of us might call a sense of harmony with nature. Nature, in their view, is not a physical entity apart from man, and therefore cannot confront it or oppose it or harmonise with it as a separate entity. He says you can unbalance the system by personal malfunctioning as a component within it, but you can never be truly apart from it and looking at it. So survival and the maintenance of a certain quality of life are possible only if all other life forms too are allowed to evolve according to their specific needs, as stated in the cosmological myths and traditions. So it's all explained, in terms of a story about the creation of the universe, but it functions as an adaptive system to keep real life in balance. So that's some examples of shamanic cultures, if you like, and systems that have existed in South America. I'm going to jump now to sort of folk healing, or Peruvian vegetalismo, sometimes called, and this is much closer to, if you're familiar with ayahuasca practices and ayahuasca healing, this would be much closer to what you sort of expect. And these are generally, they have indigenous elements in them, but they're urban mestizo practices. So mestizo means mixed. This is someone of indigenous mixed with European ancestry. So compared with the systems that I just explained briefly before, this world here of the vegetalismo is less about a sort of totalizing worldview that controls all actions, and it's more aligned with the medicine in the way that we might think about it. You have something like a traditional doctor-patient relationship. But there are many aspects of indigenous shamanism that have been maintained. It's not completely separate. And some of those aspects are the invisible landscape, which is always in shamanism, and this is also in vegetalismo. Often seen as crucial to health, but not always. Sometimes they're quite happy to work with pharmacological Western medicine as long as it works. That's fine, but they tend to fall back on traditional methods or shamanic methods when it's not effective. So this landscape here that is full of spirits, both good and bad, definitely been maintained as the idea of taboos and restrictions on behaviour. Sexual restrictions and dietary restrictions are particularly prevalent, and also the existence of good and bad shamans has been maintained as well. Although in the urban context, the evil shaman does it in secret. It doesn't have a socially sanctioned function. It's something that accusations fly. Oh, this guy's actually a brujo. He's an evil shaman, but the healer, the doctor, is in the open about what's going on. So here's a painting of it's a spiritual heart operation by Pablo Amaringo. Some of you might be familiar with his paintings. They're really quite beautiful. And he was painting his visions that he had. He was a curandero in Peru. He died, I don't know, it might be 20 years ago now. But this is one of his original visions or experiences that he had. So that's him in the middle with his chest open, and in the experience, he had a real heart condition. That's what he was going. His father was a healer and suggested that he do this. And in the vision, it's very realistic. He had his chest cracked open by this doctor with a hammer, cut the arteries and removed the heart completely. Started doing some operations on it with his assistant, and then he was showing Pablo, this is your problem. You've got problems here. This artery's blocked or whatever the situation is. Fixed it up, put the heart back in, sewed up the wound, and told him you have to fast for a week. So there you go, straight away you get these food restrictions. If you don't fast for a week, this thing is not going to work. Okay, so he fasted for a week and said that his heart problems resolved and never came back again. So this was his entry into healing with ayahuasca, and he became a healer. And his paintings came after he retired later on. So although you have a, again, like a complex world of spirits and entities, you can see them in here, these little bits of energy around the Maloka there where it's being done, also up on top. There's always ideas about energy or revealing this other aspect of the world that's not normally visible. And it's more idiosyncratic to the healer. In the background you can see UFOs. And there's not a lot of explanation about why he includes those in his paintings in the book, other than he just sees them and he knows they're around and he paints them in. But even though there's a lot of difference between these mestizo healers, there are constants that are nearly always there. And one of them is tobacco. The same as tobacco is found all across South American shamanism and in probably North American as well, and maybe even beyond that, is the use of tobacco. So this is considered to be central and a sort of multi-purpose tool in the shaman's toolkit, if you like. And there's a lot of different ways you can use it. One example is to make a particular medicine. For so you're giving someone ayahuasca. You want to make this ayahuasca spiritually safe or energetically safe. They'll blow tobacco smoke onto it to cleanse it or something like that. Another example of the use, which is depicted in this painting here, is the use of tobacco as a kind of bridge between the healer and the patient. So you're kind of connecting to the person on some energetic level, which is part of the invisible landscape that we've been talking about, and then you can manipulate the energy of the person in some way. So if you conceptualize sickness as this thing here, we can start to work with it and move it away. And that is also found. Those ideas are found also throughout South American shamanism. Often they'll use a sucking mechanism. This comes up all the time. So the pathogenic object, which for the shaman exists in the spiritual reality, is removed, and tobacco can be used in a similar sense. So they're all connected to these ideas of the invisible world and the energy landscape. But one question is to use tobacco, and the way we would often think about it is it's like a sort of symbolic gesture. Academics would normally, or anthropologists would normally analyze it in symbolic terms because you're blowing the smoke and it means something to the person, and that's one way of analysing it. But the healer doesn't understand it like that. Understands it as an actual physical technology, if you like. So to be able to use tobacco in the first place, because they're not seeing this as just a purely symbolic gesture, but they're seeing it as some sort of active technology, you've got to know how to use tobacco, which means you have to know the plant in this tradition. And the way to know plants is to do what's called a Dieta. And the Dieta maintains all these components of the taboos and the restrictions, specifically in terms of sexual and dietary restrictions. So to put the body into a particular state, there can't be any sexual activity, and food is restricted to very, very simple food. So nothing spicy, nothing salty, nothing sweet, basically nothing that tastes good. It is a very, very simple, bland, boring diet. And in this state, which could go on for quite a while, you start to take in the plant that you want to learn. It could be ayahuasca, but it could be tobacco, it could be a whole range of different plants. And this sort of hypersensitive state, the idea is that you start to go into an altered state, and the plant will start to reveal things to you. The spirit that exists there will start to explain. And, there's all kinds of examples of people talking about, the plant as some anthropomorphic entity sort of comes up out of the plant in their vision and tells them, oh, you should use this plant for this thing. Okay, they start doing it. So that's one way of using using a Dieta as a way of learning directly from nature, if you like. But another way is just to apply this as a purely medical technique. They'll do it for the patient. The patient should do this thing, and use it for all kinds of stuff like healing bones, rheumatic disorders. There's a whole bunch of parasites, many different things. But for a Peruvian curandero, and probably outside of Peru as well, this diet process is considered to be absolutely fundamental, because they think of themselves as taking in energy as well. So you're working with patients, you're moving energy around, you need to kind of cleanse it off, and the diet is one way of doing that. So there's quite a large health literature now on ayahuasca, not only from a clinical perspective, but even from indigenous and even religious studies. But you could consider, at least in the Peruvian context, the use of just ayahuasca on its own and nothing else is, in my view, probably a response to Western interest. So there's been an ongoing process of what could be called shamanic tourism or ayahuasca tourism, where Westerners come over and are willing to pay a lot of money to have an authentic ayahuasca experience, and that kind of alters the landscape to some extent and causes this intense focus on ayahuasca. When if you look at the traditional healing practices, ayahuasca is used for sure and it's popular, but they always know other plants, and it's sort of a mark of the curandero's ability. How many plants does he work with, and what kind of because the plants often give you songs, magical songs. I haven't talked much about that, but that's also a common process. So again, the context of the social context matters, and what these how these plants play out and what they actually are. And the last thing I just wanted to point out, running about half an hour, these like shared themes throughout traditional healing cultures. And I've been reading about some Aboriginal Australian medicine, and you see these concordances that match up, and they're definitely not transmitted by cultural information transmission. And it's some interesting stuff. So, one example in this particular book, this is about Ngangkari healing, and the Ngangkari healers are working with the Royal Adelaide Hospital, I believe. They've been integrated, so they're doing good work there. But there was a story in there about a woman who was a health worker and touched a healer, basically, without knowing the person was a healer, and touched this person and got this very strange feeling, the way they described it, sort of felt like they'd done something wrong, but they didn't know what it was. And everyone was sort of looking at them, and they had this like splitting headache and felt absolutely awful, to the point where they're thinking maybe they're going to die. And people explained, you touched a Ngangkari healer in the middle of them doing some work, so that you get this energetic transfer to the other person. You need to get the Ngangkari to sort it out. So the Ngangkari comes along and straightens them out, and did this like sucking process on their forehead, and then spat out a bunch of blood on the ground, which the person had to clean up, not the healer. And then apparently went to sleep and felt much better the next day. And that is completely classic idea of the healer, having access to this other aspect of reality and being able to move energy around. So this is just almost identical to conceptions of South American shamanism, including the sucking component on the body. And then one other example that I came across in the work of Johannes Wilbert on the Warao with the tobacco shamanism, and they had this very detailed story of all the ordeals that the apprentice would have to pass through. One of those ordeals, this is in Venezuela, is that the apprentice gets to this point where there's like a door that's like closing really quickly, and he has to go through that door. If the door touches him, then sorry, you failed. You're not going to become a healer, and you're going to die in real life. But if you pass through the door, then there's I think like a bird in there, and it starts telling you things, and you've gone through, you've succeeded. That exact thing exists in the Wiradjuri people. It's in New South Wales, I think. I'm not particularly familiar with this culture, but they have, it was described the exact same thing, this door that rapidly opens and closes, which the doctors go through, was the way they talked about it. And to touch it meant death. So you have very strange concordances, and this is across continents, and I don't think would have travelled by information transfer, normal information transfer. And just to stick on to these things, my work with the Chamane, reading some of their mythology, which people don't really know anymore. It's just been recorded, but people are forgetting it. There's also a place where at the end of the world, they would say that the sky touches the ground, just rapidly opens and closes. And I remember reading that thinking, that's a very odd thing. I'd never come across it before, but after that I'd read other examples of it. And for them, that was, the end of the world. Possibly, it would be nice to know if the Chamane shamans, were seen to kind of pass through that point at the end of the world and then into the world beyond. Well, we'll never know, because that's been lost. It's finished now. So just to wrap this up, give you some final thoughts. Returning kind of to the beginning, What's the relation between these two things, psychedelic medicine and the use of plants? They're obviously related in some sense, but they're also radically different. And I think, to me, like the psychedelic revolution, what's happening now is sort of its own unique case. It's its own thing. And to understand it, what is happening, I think we would need to consider not just drugs and not just drug therapy, but also the social context of the 21st century and, what is going on. So that includes culture, social regulatory structures, the creation of knowledge, as well as capitalism and industry and all the interactions between these things. So they're determining what this will be. And just as one example, one last example, Maria Sabina, the curandera from Mexico, who's did her work with sacred mushrooms, and is probably responsible for the West's knowledge of psilocybin in the first place through her relationship with Gordon Wasson. The way she worked and what her knowledge was would for sure not make it through the filtering process that would occur to transform that kind of knowledge into a certified and sort of marketable medicine. So there's a difference there that's not necessarily compatible. So I'll leave it there with some thoughts. Big takeaway, I guess, is these shamanic traditions are very diverse, but they're not arbitrary. There are these similarities, and they're historical, but they're also contemporary and ongoing. So I would really not like to see shamanism and traditional medicine described as a precursor or something to psychedelic medicine, but rather alternate track, if you like, and it's still occurring today. And then questions that you can ask yourself is, how does psychedelic medicine, or how will it differ from these plant-based traditions? I've tried to kind of expand a little bit upon that. And also, what social role will psychedelic medicines play? So what is the set and setting of the 21st century, and what kind of worldviews will they support? It's going to be less like a shamanic, totalizing worldview, but still it has some kind of social function, and what will that be? And something that I would like to see, but will there be space for traditional medicine in a legal or regulatory framework? So I'll leave it at that. We can open up to questions. As I said, if anyone wants any of the slides or any information, just send me an email, and I'd be happy to share. Thank you.